Number 1. The murder of Penny Bell. On a bright Thursday morning in June 1991, 43-year-old Penny Bell left her home in Buckinghamshire. She told the builders renovating her house that she had an urgent appointment, but she never specified where she was going. Penny was a highly successful businesswoman and a devoted mother. But something that morning was terribly wrong. Before her appointment, she visited her bank and withdrew £8,500 in cash. She never told her husband or business partners why she needed the money. Witnesses later saw her driving her pale blue Jaguar XJS through West London. But she wasn't alone. A man was sitting in the passenger seat. According to police files, she was driving erratically, and at one point, she was seen mouthing the words, "Help me," to a passing driver. Just before 11 in the morning, Penny parked at the Gunnell Leisure Centre in Greenford. In broad daylight, surrounded by other parked cars and pedestrians going about their daily routines, the man in the passenger seat launched a frenzied, terrifying attack. He pulled out a long knife and stabbed Penny over 50 times from the passenger seat. The sheer brutality of the attack shocked seasoned detectives. Despite the bustling location and the open car windows, not a single person reported hearing a struggle or a scream. The killer calmly exited the vehicle and melted away into the crowds, leaving Penny dead behind the steering wheel. When police eventually discovered her blood-soaked Jaguar, they realized the £8,500 in cash was completely gone. Decades later, Scotland Yard is still baffled. Was Penny being blackmailed? Was she lured into a ransom drop that went horribly wrong? The man in the passenger seat was never identified, and this brutal, broad daylight assassination remains completely unsolved to this day. Number 2. The murder of Tracy Mertens. In December 1994, 31-year-old Tracy Mertens traveled to Birmingham to collect a few items from her former home. She had recently moved away with her family to escape mounting debts, but she had no idea that returning to that house would lead to one of the most agonizing and savage murders in British criminal history. While Tracy was inside the empty house, a sudden, violent knock at the door startled her. Two unidentified men barged inside. According to police reports, they immediately cornered her and demanded to know where her boyfriend was, claiming he owed them a substantial amount of drug money. When Tracy couldn't give them an answer, the men decided to use her to send a terrifying message. The intruders violently abducted Tracy, shoving her into the back of a stolen yellow Ford Escort. They blindfolded her and drove for miles out of the city, eventually stopping at the remote graveyard of Christ Church in Eton, Cheshire. It was a bitterly cold winter day, and the churchyard was completely deserted. What happened next is almost too horrific to comprehend. The men dragged Tracy out of the car and forced her onto the freezing steps of the church. They then doused her completely in petrol. While she was begging for her life, one of the men struck a match and set her on fire. They watched her burn for several moments before getting back into the stolen car and speeding away, leaving her to die alone in sheer agony. Despite suffering catastrophic 95% burns to her entire body, Tracy miraculously survived the initial attack. A passerby found her staggering through the churchyard, her clothes completely incinerated. She was rushed to a specialist burns unit. Astonishingly, she clung to life for another 12 hours, staying conscious just long enough to give detectives a description of her killers. She described her attackers as two men speaking with thick Birmingham accents, and she described the yellow car they drove. But despite this agonizing final testimony, the men were never found. Tracy succumbed to her horrific injuries the following day. Today, her killers are still walking the streets, completely unpunished for carrying out one of the most medieval executions in modern UK history. Number 3. The murder of Serisiem. The quiet village of Argod in South Wales is the last place you would expect to encounter pure, unhinged evil. But in November 2014, the Sirowi Arms Hotel, which was being used as a temporary hostel, became the site of a crime so grotesque it sounds like a horror film. 22-year-old Serisiem met a 34-year-old man named Matthew Williams and agreed to walk back to his room. She had absolutely no idea that Williams was a recently released, highly dangerous offender who was suffering from severe drug-induced psychosis. Shortly after Saris entered his room, The other residents in the building heard sudden, blood-curdling screams echoing through the thin walls. Realizing the young woman was in agonizing pain, the terrified hostel staff ran to his door and desperately tried to force it open. When they finally broke through the barricaded door, they were met with a scene of unimaginable butchery. Matthew Williams was crouched over Saris on the floor. He hadn't just attacked her, he was actively eating her alive. The staff watched in absolute paralyzing horror as Williams, in a completely feral state of mania, tore into her face and consumed her eyeball while she was still conscious. The traumatized staff immediately dialed 999, frantically reporting a literal cannibalistic attack in progress. When police officers stormed the room minutes later, Williams was still hunched over her mutilated body, completely unresponsive to their commands to back away. The officers immediately deployed a high-voltage taser to subdue him. The electrical shock incapacitated Williams, and he went into sudden cardiac arrest. Williams died on the floor of the hostel just moments later. Tragically, it was too late for Karis. She had suffered catastrophic, unsurvivable injuries to her face and neck, and she was pronounced dead at the bloody scene. The sheer animalistic savagery of the attack deeply traumatized everyone who witnessed it. To this day, the Argode cannibal attack remains one of the most viscerally horrifying murders in modern British history. Number 4. The murder of Kellyanne Bates. In April 1996, police were called to a home in Manchester. What they found inside remains one of the most prolonged and sadistic acts of torture in British legal history. The victim was 17-year-old Kellyanne Bates, and her killer was her 49-year-old boyfriend, James Patterson Smith. Smith was a deeply manipulative and violent man who had systematically isolated the teenager from her family. But absolutely no one could have predicted the sheer magnitude of the violence he would inflict upon her. According to the Home Office pathologist who later examined her, the trauma she endured was completely unprecedented. Over a torturous 4-week period, Kelly was kept captive inside Smith's home and subjected to methodical, escalating violence. The medical examiner cataloged over 150 distinct injuries on her body. Smith had systematically crushed her fingers, burned her with a hot iron, and stabbed her multiple times. But the most stomach-churning detail of the ordeal was what he did to her face. While Kelly was still conscious and fighting for her life, Smith brutally gouged out both of her eyes with a blunt instrument. In court, medical experts testified that she miraculously survived in this blinded, agonizing state for up to 3 whole weeks. During those final weeks of utter darkness and unimaginable pain, Smith continued his daily campaign of physical and psychological torture. He starved her and kept her bound, deliberately prolonging her suffering for as long as physically possible. Finally, mercifully, Kelly was drowned in a bathtub, ending the month-long nightmare. When experienced detectives arrived at the house, many had to leave the room. The sheer sadism of the crime scene deeply traumatized the investigating officers. James Patterson Smith was given a life sentence, with the presiding judge describing the case as an unbelievable catalog of human depravity. Because Kellyanne Bates was so young and the details of her torture were so profoundly disturbing, her case is rarely discussed or fully detailed in mainstream true crime television. It remains a dark, horrifying testament to the absolute limits of cruelty that can happen behind a closed door. Number 5. The murder of Jimmy Prout. In 2016, 45-year-old Jimmy Prout lived in North Shields. He was a vulnerable man who fell under the absolute psychological control of a man named Zahid Zaman. Zaman ran a sadistic, cult-like dynamic from his house, manipulating a group of followers into turning against Jimmy. What began as local bullying soon escalated into a campaign of medieval torture. Zaman and his group convinced themselves that Jimmy was a thief, using this bizarre delusion to justify horrific daily abuse. They essentially held Jimmy captive, forcing him to sleep outside in the freezing winter weather without any proper clothing. According to Newcastle Crown Court transcripts, the group methodically stripped Jimmy of his basic humanity, treating him worse than an animal in his final weeks of life. The physical torture he endured is truly stomach-churning. The group used a heavy hammer and a chisel to forcibly smash out Jimmy's teeth while he was still conscious. He was subjected to systematic, brutal beatings on a daily basis. Medical examiners later found that Jimmy had suffered multiple fractured ribs, severe internal injuries, and extreme malnourishment. He was completely broken by his captors. Despite living on a normal residential street surrounded by neighbors, Jimmy's torment went completely unnoticed. The cult dynamic was so intoxicating that none of the perpetrators showed him a single ounce of mercy. Eventually, Jimmy succumbed to the horrific accumulated trauma of his injuries. But rather than call the authorities, Zaman and his accomplices decided to treat his corpse like absolute garbage. They stuffed Jimmy's emaciated body into a sleeping bag. In the dead of night, they dragged him into a patch of overgrown wasteland near the A19 highway, just a short walk from the house where he was tortured. They dumped him in the brambles and left him to rot. To cover their tracks, Zaman even forced the others to help him stage a fake, highly publicized search party for their quote-unquote missing friend. When police finally uncovered the truth and found Jimmy's decomposed remains weeks later, they were sickened by the sheer depravity of the crime. Experienced detectives stated it was one of the darkest, most sadistic cases they had ever encountered in the Northeast. The perpetrators were handed life sentences, closing the book on one of the most twisted and terrifying cult murders in modern British history. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Until next time, remember to stay safe and vigilant. Have a good night.
Everything leads to nothing, and every time I see you, I need you to stay. And everything leads to nothing, and every time I see you, I need you to stay. Peace of me is falling inside.